The British research was built around two foundational ideas. And these, when I read this in their work, it was as though somebody had gotten to the ideas that I was trying to formulate myself as I promised the department, yes, I will create this new field. That there are something called second-order historical concepts. And they distinguish between first-order historical concepts, which are what history is about. Prime ministers, wars, the Enlightenment. These are what history of progression. The second foundational idea is that one can make progress in developing more sophistication in thinking about a notion like historical evidence or historical significance. So these two concepts essentially set up a research program for me, which then became the core of what I did, certainly through the first decade of my work. Historical significance points to the idea that the past itself is vast, unlimited. We can't know it all. We have to make some choices about what's worthwhile to spend our time on, what's worthwhile to put into school curriculum, what's worthwhile to write historical monographs about, what's worthwhile to read about. And those notions of historical significance then shape the kinds of histories of historical significance. If we had a very simple idea of what is historically significant, we might think in terms of the impact of a certain event or certain people over a long period of time on a large number of people in very profound ways. So one could argue for the significance of World War I in those terms. One could argue for the significance of John A. Macdonald in those terms. But you would have a history, if that's all you considered historically significant, you'd have the shape of history would be quite different from what we see in historical journals and, in fact, in history textbooks today. So it's not adequate. I wanted to see what students' ideas about this term were. So I designed a number of exercises. One of the most interesting ones was one where I went into grade 11 classrooms in Vancouver and asked students, gave them a blank sheet of paper and asked them to select the 10 or so most significant events or people in all of world history. I asked this student, why these selections for all of world history? He said, well, that's what we studied this year. And so those must be the most significant. That's what I remember. That's, in other words, these weren't his words, but this is my sort of reinterpretation of his words. If these aren't the most significant events, why are we spending our time studying? A contrasting view was this one. And I think we start up in the upper left-hand portion of this. Stone Age, become industrial, wars, invention of cars, planes, very awful history in general, computers invented, technology boom, virtual reality, CD-ROM, not many wars at all. So now this was in the 1990s, before more wars got going. But he's done something very different, obviously, and you can see a narrative embedded in here. Some judgment, very awful story in general. That's a very interesting judgment, and no particular connection with the material that he had been studying in the classroom. So he's used his interests, but tried to put them together in a way that means starts at the top. World is created, rise of Homo sapiens, factories are built, the rise of industrialism, cars are invented, rise of convenience, plastic is invented, more convenience, CFCs are invented, convenience and comfort, world is slowly destroyed. A very clear narrative drawn here. And if we look at something like plastic is invented, Is that one of the most significant events in all of world history? Well, I don't think she's wrong for putting it here, but the way that it becomes significant in her account of it here is that it has a place in a larger narrative. And it's by its place, any one of the details, any particular event, achieves its significance by its place in this narrative that has meaning for us, that's important for us to listen to and to pay attention to. And so in fact, this put into perspective to me how historians work as well. That you might have a particular detail where you say, well, that historian could have put it in or left it out, but it is because it has this place in a larger story that has meaning to us, that that's how a particular event acquires its historical significance. A very authority-related one to a very subjective one, to a third type, which I called the narrative type of explanation for historical significance. So we came up with different types. The next sample of research that I want to show you looked at these three different second order concepts. I was actually going after the notion of progress and decline with this, but it turned out that there were the students' responses were much more interesting about these three second order concepts. How much do they understand the challenge of the difference between the past and the present, and the need to both the need to get into the mindset of people in the past, but also the huge challenge of doing that. How can we shed our own present-day concepts in order to do that? So that's historical perspective taking. And the third, the ethical dimension, how do we make judgments about people in the past and events in the past, and what they mean for us today. 36 students total. And I gave them a tape recorder and gave them some pictures to discuss, and with basically just these three questions, and left the room, let them discuss them on their own. The caption that's coming out of the mouth of the man sitting on the porch is, "My boy, we've toiled and taken care of you long enough. Now you've got to get to work." And this is 1865. So I gave this to these unsuspecting Canadian students who had not studied U.S. history. Maybe they think that we've taken care of you. Maybe they think that how whites, they took over the world, established, you know what I mean? And then the blacks just come, they lived there first, right? No, they owned them. I mean, in the very beginning, when the whites came and the blacks came or something, the blacks didn't have power. They shipped them over. They were imported by white people. So what we have here, I think, is Canadian students. I mean, I was trying to get at the second order concepts here. The Canadian students had studied the relations between Aboriginal people and white people in Canada. This is another story of race relations. 7C, particularly, is thinking, well, the black people had been there and the white people came over and took over. So they've got sort of a Canadian race relations story superimposed on this picture. 7A and 7B do straighten out this student, so it ends up being okay. But if you don't, this is what makes examination of the second order concepts so difficult, is you really have to know some history in order to start even making some sense of it. Otherwise you can go very wrong. This is another group. What is the picture about? I don't know, what do you think? It's like go and work while the guy sits on his ass and reads the paper. Like how these guys in their nice big fancy home and this guy's about to go pick and hoe the fields. What is all this we've taken care of you for They're all inside, and the guy's not even allowed, the black guy's not even allowed in there. Not even to talk to the guy. Rock back and forth, read my paper, and I wonder what that black guy is thinking. Like, sure, guy, I think I want to kill you. Now, these were students in an alternative school for at-risk students, and they, my analysis of this is that they really identified with this scene, and they, first of all, they got a lot of the interpretation right. They saw what was going on. They saw the problem, and in fact, they saw it so empathetically that they started acting out the parts. They're giving voice to the words that they imagine the black person and the white person. They create a little play here between the characters, which is fascinating. They don't have any historical distance. They don't, and they didn't with any of the rest of the questions. They don't think about when was this cartoon created, what was the author trying to say. It's all a kind of immediate immersion, and the moral judgments that they come up with as a result of that are very much in the situation, which has some strengths, but it also has some weaknesses. Was the photographer or artist trying to make a point with this picture? Back then, it would have been a different point to what we see now, right? So they're starting right out with historical times are different from now. We think differently from then. Yeah. Completely different, because back then, they were probably trying to make a point that the black people didn't work enough, or maybe that they were lazy, right? So they're going wrong here. They got a good start, and then they start to go wrong. Yeah. And he has the instructions to go to work, which he should have known. But now we see it like he shouldn't have been going to work anyway for him without pay anyway. Now we see it as racism. That's the first thing you think of when you look at this picture. Yeah, unless the artist was really advanced in his thinking, saying, really, they're better if they're working. Yeah, there were like sympathetic people. It's possible because it almost looks more like that. Because if you look at them, the slave is much more portrayed as like a really strong-looking person. I don't know, if you look at the other people, they look really weak, and the slave's in the foreground and the rest of them in the back. It almost seemed like the artist was sympathetic with the slave. So they work around with this, they take a wrong turn, but then they get it right. They've got the moral judgments, they understand the moral the problems that are being depicted here, but they also have a historical difference, historical distance. The third and last study, and that was where I made some clips of the film Dances with. And then after showing them these clips, I showed them clips from The Searchers, which is a John Wayne film made in 1956. And it's about the same era. It's just post-U.S. Civil War, and John Wayne on the left is the hero. And basically, it's a lot of the same story. Except the heroes and the villains are reversed. And so I asked them these questions. What did you see, after each segment, what did you see in the segment? Tell me the main differences you saw between the segments. Are there any heroes, villains, or victims in these films? And they pegged those very accurately. How would you explain the differences between these two films? And which is more accurate in its picture of life in the West in the 1860s? And how do you know? Well, they all said that Dances with Wolves was more accurate. I started wondering about the impact of spending a career doing this kind of work in schools. So in 2004, I developed a partnership with an organization which was then called the Historica Foundation, which was a Canada-wide organization. Their mission statement was pretty much like the Dominion Institute's mission statement. they wanted to tell the wonderful stories that made Canada unique. And I challenged them, and I offered a definition of, a very preliminary definition of what historical thinking might be. And surprisingly to me, the historical board was very enthusiastic about this, and they embraced it. 2006 convened a group of people to put together a program for the next bit that would have an impact on schools. And our first task was to define a basic number of historical thinking concepts. This is what we've been working with. To establish historical significance, why we care today about certain events, trends, and issues in history. Use primary source evidence, how to find, select, contextualize, and interpret sources for a historical argument. Identify continuity and change, what has changed and what has remained the same over time. Analyze cause and consequence, how and why certain conditions and actions led to others. Take historical perspectives, understand the past as a foreign country with its different social, cultural, intellectual, and emotional context. And finally, the ethical dimension of historical interpretations, how we in the present judge actors in different circumstances in the past, how different interpretations of the past reflect different moral stances today, when and how crimes of the past bear consequences today. So we basically constructed a campaign around developing materials for these, approaching textbook publishers with these, enlisting teachers' associations, enlisting ministries of education to work on these. We have a website which on the right-hand side defines these historical concepts. We've had pilot programs going with groups of teachers in 7 different cities across Canada, including Toronto and Vancouver, but also some smaller jurisdictions. And those teachers have developed lessons that are around substantive topics in the curriculum, but also highlight one or more of the historical thinking concepts. On the website, we also have student work, and we have teachers' comments on the student work. We hope, Kadria and Tom Morton and I hope to undertake a Canada-wide study that will first look at the curricula, see where historical thinking comes into the curricula. We're not going to publish a report card in the way that the Dominion Institute did, but examine where does historical thinking and an explicit discussion of historical thinking come up in curricula, and then survey teachers, and then examine students. That's all tremendously difficult. Since we started the Benchmarks project, there are teachers who have worked with these concepts at all different grade levels. So we don't have published research on it. We have lessons that are appropriate for different grade levels. And we've had interest and very strong involvement at the elementary school level from a group that was working outside of Winnipeg.